to HaTorah.
All right. Shalom, everyone, and welcome to our course on Mashiach. I'm quite excited to be able to give this course about different ideas and different elements to the coming of Mashiach. Of course, whenever we study, we always talk about Mashiach, but we haven't yet dedicated an entire course to the actual study of Mashiach. So it's good. It's important. I think we're doing the right thing by talking about and studying about Mashiach. Anybody that has studied or seen any of the Rebbe's teachings knows that the Rebbe spoke about Mashiach tremendously. The Rebbe really spoke about the ideas of Mashiach and the coming of Mashiach. The Rebbe really spoke about the imminent arrival of Mashiach, how close we are, how the world is transforming into a messianic world. That was really on the Rebbe's mind. And one of the things that the Rebbe spoke about numerous times was that the best way that we can prepare for the coming of Mashiach, because as we are going to learn in this class, it actually is somewhat dependent on us. The arrival of Mashiach does necessitate our involvement in our work. So the best way that we can prepare for the coming of Mashiach is to study about Mashiach. To study what the Torah says about Mashiach is the surest way to bring about the coming of Mashiach, which is connected a lot to Torah in general, because through studying Torah about any concept, that's how you make it a reality. So for sure, when it comes to Mashiach, it's the same way. Through studying the Torah about Mashiach, that is how we bring about the coming of Mashiach. So we begin with class 1, which is today, called Poof, or process. And it's definitely a good place to start, because when you kind of close your eyes and you think about Mashiach, you think about the world changing into a messianic reality, into a world where there's no sickness and there's no hatred and there's no jealousy, all these kinds of things. How does it work? Will I just be sitting in my seat right over here at my computer and poof, all of a sudden, from a crazy world where things seem ridiculous and things seem crazy, boom, we just wake up instantly in a messianic world? Or is it more of a process that there's things that has to happen? There's step 1 that has to take place, and then there's step 2 that has to take place, and then there's step 3 that has to take place, etc., etc. So which one is it? Is it poof, or is it process? And how does that work? So turns out, like anything, like any good Jewish subject, there's actually sources going both ways. We'll see readings in the prophets and the other places where it describes Mashiach as coming very suddenly. The world is just going to be doing its business as regular, and out of nowhere Mashiach will come. And then we have other places where it describes that no, Mashiach will come as more of a process. It will be more of a natural idea. So, this messianic world will kind of naturally evolve into it. So really, we're going to see both of them, and then we're going to talk about which one is it, or how does it work. So the first thing that we do is we turn to this is a reading that comes from the prophet of Malachi. And Malachi, this is, if you have the student book, it's in page 2. If you don't have it, I will mail it out to you this week. But the prophet Malachi says, "Behold, I send my angel, and he will clear a way before me. And suddenly, God, whom you will seek, will come to his temple, and behold, the angel of the covenant whom you desire is coming, said God of hosts." So the prophet Malachi describes this sudden appearance, this sudden change where we're all minding our own business, and poof, all of a sudden, Mashiach comes, and the world is completely different. So we're going to connect this with other sources that also describe Mashiach's coming as a complete miraculous event. Does that make sense? So we're talking about Poof or process, and we're talking about, is it going to be miraculous or natural, gradual or sudden? We're kind of tying those two. We're saying there's some sources that are going to describe it as miraculous and sudden. The world doesn't look like it's ready, but it's going to happen. And some sources are going to talk about it as something being natural and something which is going to be gradual. So there we saw the from Malachi, and here we have, there you go, for some reason coming up again. And here we have from the Rambam. So the Rambam, Maimonides, in addition to all of the many books that he wrote a very famous letter that's called Igeret Teiman. Anybody ever heard of Igeret Teiman? Igeret Teiman was a letter that the Rambam Maimonides wrote to the people of Teiman that were under a tremendous amount of pressure and they were under tremendous stress. And it was a beautiful letter that he wrote, kind of encouraging them. So he writes over there about Mashiach, and he says the Messiah will be unknown before his coming, but he will prove by means of miracles and wonders that he's the true Messiah. The mere report of his advent will strike terror into the hearts of all the kings of the earth, and their kingdoms will fall as they will be unable to make war or revolt against him. They will neither defame, deny, nor question him, for the miracles that he will perform will frighten them into complete silence. Isaiah refers to the submission of the kings to the Messiah in the verse, kings shall shut their mouths, for he will be unlike anything they ever saw or heard. He will slay whom he will, none will escape or be saved, as is written, he shall smite the land with the rod of his mouth. So you see over here, the Rambam talks about this sudden change, this mighty king called the King Moshiach, who's going to appear and who's going to force all the nations of the world into submission. No one's going to have any chance of standing up against him. And as a result of this sudden miraculous change, just a crazy change in the world, we will obviously be able to return to Israel and rebuild the temple, all the other prophecies that come together with the coming of the Mashiach. So there you have at least two sources, and there are many more, but these are just two sample sources that describe the coming of Mashiach as sudden and as miraculous. It won't make any sense. You won't be sitting in a world that, you won't see the gradual rise to power of a king. It will be just sudden. So now we're going to go the other way. And now we're going to look at sources that say it the other way, that the arrival of Mashiach is actually a gradual and a very natural process. And obviously, eventually we'll deal with this contradiction. Which way is it and how does it work? So far we've had two sources, one from the prophet Malachi, one from the Rambam Maimonides in a letter called Igeret Teiman, a letter that he wrote to the Jews of Yemen, describing Mashiach as sudden and as miraculous. And now let's take a look at the other way. This text is from the Jerusalem Talmud, and it says as follows. Rabbi Chia bar Abba and Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta were walking in the valley of Arbel, and they witnessed the advent of dawn. So apparently they were up very early in the morning, and they were watching dawn. Rabbi Chia told Rabbi Shimon, so will be the redemption of the Jewish people. At first, it will be a trickle, and as it continues, it will gain steam and expand. As it is stated, though I will sit in darkness, God is a light to me. So in this Talmud, they kind of compare the arrival of Mashiach to the idea of dawn, right? If you've ever watched the dawn, it's a gradual process. It starts getting lighter and lighter and lighter until eventually you have a full sun and a beautiful light outside. So it's a gradual process that takes time. So he compared the redemption, Moshiach, to the idea of dawn. Similarly, we have from Maimonides again, which not from the same works, but here we have from Maimonides called Mishnah Torah, the Laws of Kings. The Rambam kind of goes the other way that he went before, and he says one should not presume that the Messianic king must work miracles and wonders, bring about new phenomena in the world, resurrect the dead, or perform other similar deeds. This is not the case. So just to give you a little bit of an understanding of what the Rambam is talking about over here, Maimonides in this section that we're reading now is talking about how do you know who Mashiach is. He actually gives you legal ramifications to know who is a Mashiach and who is not Mashiach. Because unfortunately, throughout Jewish history, there have been what's called false Mashiachs, people that have gotten up and have said, I am a Mashiach, and they've brought this crazy fervor amongst Jewish people, only to turn out that they're a false Mashiach. So in this work, which is a legalistic work from the Rambam is describing to us what is the legal ramifications for who Mashiach is. If somebody claims to be a Mashiach, how do we know if he is or is not? So the Rambam says he doesn't have to make miracles and wonders or bring about a new phenomenon in the world. That's not the definition of Mashiach. Rather, what is? So here's the continuation. Do not presume that in the Messianic age, any facet of the world's nature will change, or there will be innovations in the work of creation. Rather, the world will continue according to its pattern, because our sages taught there will be no difference between the current age and the Messianic era, except our emancipation from the subjugation to the Gentile kingdoms. The Rambam says the only difference between now and the era of Mashiach is the subjugation to Gentile kingdoms. Now we live all around the world. We're not free to go to Israel and build a temple and live a Torah life the way it is ideally supposed to be lived. So Mashiach will allow that to happen. Right? Like imagine a King Solomon era. That's pretty much during the reign of King Solomon. There was still sickness. It wasn't a miraculous world, but the Jewish people at that time were not subjugated to any Gentile kingdoms. So here you have from the Rambam very clearly that the Mashiach is not a miraculous change in the world. It's more of a, gradual, natural process that the world goes through, and it leads to a time where we have a king that frees us from the subjugation to Gentile kingdoms, and that's what Mashiach is. So in short, we're left with this, if you will, contradiction amongst Jewish sources, that in one place Mashiach has described as a natural, gradual process. That's what we learn from the Talmud and from the Rambam. On the other hand, we quoted from Malachi, from the prophet Malachi, and from another place in the Rambam, in Maimonides, describing Mashiach as this magical, sudden, miraculous change in what's going to take place in the world. And there's many more sources to prove each way. We just chose two to show this way and two to choose that way, but really we can bring many more to choose each way. And now we want to deal with, how does that work? So before I want to carry on, I just want to ask anybody if they have any questions or comments that they would like to clarify. If you do, please unmute your mic and speak up. Anyone? All right. I suppose everything is clear, right? Richard, did you want to ask something?
Rabbi, I have a question.
Yes.
Okay. You said about the redemption. Please forgive my ignorance. But the Jewish people is no longer subject to any nation. I mean, we are free to go to Israel whenever we want to. What holds us back to go back to Israel? Nothing. If this first lesson was 100 years ago, for instance, I could totally understand that. But today, we have the freedom to go back to Israel. Okay.
Yeah, it's a great question. We do have the freedom to practically and physically go back to Israel, but Israel today is, when we talk about going back to Israel, we talk about going back to Israel and rebuilding the Beit HaMikdash, rebuilding the temple, creating a Sanhedrin, creating a high court, and like I said before, running the land kind of the way that it was in the times of King Solomon. So it's already it's an age-old Jewish understanding that is going to be done when a person, King Mashiach, reveals himself and leads us back. So you are correct in the sense that we have the ability to go back to Israel, but it's not just a physical return to the land of Israel that we're waiting for. It's also the spiritual ability to be able to, yes, we have Israel because the UN decided. So we have physical access to parts of Israel, but first of all, it's not without any trouble. Unfortunately, in the last 70 years since the state of Israel, there's been many, many wars and many terrorist situations. So that in itself is already, goes to show that it's not a messianic era. And like I said, it's the physical location of Israel is part one, but it also has to be under a king like King Solomon that will allow us to run Israel according to the highest ideal standards of Torah law.
Okay.
Wasn't it also?
Okay, go ahead.
The Israelites coming out of Sinai conquered the 7 nations, but wasn't it said that there were 3 nations that had to be conquered in the future, that before we occupy all of the land intended for the Israelites?
Yes, you are referring to the fact that the messianic Israel is much larger than obviously a current Israel, which we don't have all of biblical Israel, but the messianic Israel is even bigger than biblical Israel. So biblical Israel extends much more north than we have Israel today. But biblical Israel, as you said, is the land of 7
So that
nations.
would be a limiting factor why it can't be achieved yet.
Yeah, these are all kind of part of the picture where we have access physically to parts of the lands of Israel, but there's still, a lot missing in terms of how Israel needs to be run and the enemies like the idea of being subjugated under foreign nations is even the fact that they threaten us. The idea that you have Iran that wants to destroy Israel, even that is considered kind of a subjugation, not a literal subjugation, but it's on some level a subjugation. The Israel of Moshiach is going to be completely peaceful without any trouble.
Unless, because we know that back then, Israel was divided, the tribe of North and tribe of South. The South tribe, we know who they are today. But how about the 10 tribes? The Mashiach it will be the only one that identify the tribes by the smell. The sages.
That's right.
Says.
One of the prophecies of Mashiach is the return of the 10 tribes. So all of this will kind of start fitting into the puzzle, but we're really working on the first piece of the puzzle now. There definitely will be a lot of other pieces of this puzzle that we're going to need to talk about. Now we're just kind of talking about is it a miraculous sudden experience that ushers in a messianic era, or is it a gradual natural process that ushers in the era? So all the points that everyone's talking about are all going to kind of definitely come up. And once you see how we frame these two things, you'll also better be able to understand how to view all the other promises and the prophecies about Mashiach, because there's many. Richard mentioned conquering 3 more nations in addition to the 7. DJ, you mentioned the return of the 10 tribes, all of these things. So let's kind of just frame this within the who for process, right? Is it miraculous and sudden versus gradual and natural? And then we'll be able to fit all these miracles into context. All right.
Okay. Let's go for it.
So, what?
Let's go for it.
All right, let's go for it. So we're up to part number 2, which is called the worthy versus the unworthy binary. And basically what we're going to introduce now is something very interesting. Let me just go back one slide. And that is as follows, that we are going to introduce this concept that there's 2 ways that Mashiach can come. One is called worthy and one is called unworthy. In other words, we're going to see And basically, I'll just kind of give you a little bit of a preview of what it is, and then we'll talk about it in more detail. We're going to see that there's two ways that God has set for Mashiach to come. One way is that God has given us, human beings, the job of bringing Mashiach. And if we complete our job, everything that needs to be done in order to bring Mashiach, as soon as we are finished, Mashiach comes. And we'll talk about in a few minutes what it is that we have to do. But that's one way. So in that sense, it could happen today, it could happen tomorrow. It just depends on whenever we finish doing our work. But then there's also what Hashem did, where God, he set a limit, he set a time, where by this time, regardless if mankind has done what they needed to do or not, Mashiach is going to come at a certain time. So there's an end date, which we don't know what that end date is, but there's an end date, which by then Mashiach has to come. And if we don't finish doing our work, ready or not, here I come, Mashiach comes by that end date. And
isn't that end of sixth millennium?
I don't know. If I knew exactly when it was, I'd be a rich man, you know. There's different sayings of when Mashiach would come, when Mashiach would not come, but no one can tell you exactly when it's going to be. And in these two frameworks, what's called the worthy, where if we've done our job, so then we're going to say that that is what we're talking about when we talk about Mashiach coming suddenly and miraculously, versus if we don't manage to bring Mashiach by a certain day and Mashiach comes because we reach the deadline, then it comes in a gradual and a more of a natural process. So let's unpackage all of that. There is a very interesting Talmud which reads as follows. Rabbi Alexandri says that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi raised a contradiction. There is a verse which says as follows, I, God, in its time, I will hasten it. That's the complete verse. I, God, in its time. It's a verse from Yeshayahu, Jeremiah. And he says, so Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi asked that it's a contradiction. He said it reads in its time, indicating that there is a designated time for the redemption. And the same exact verse reads, I will hasten it, indicating that there is no set time for the redemption. So, all right, the verse says, I, God, in its time, I will hasten it. So Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi asked a question. He said, which one is it? Is there a designated time for the redemption in its time? Or is it, I will hasten it, that there is no set time for the redemption and God will hasten it? So Rabbi Alexandri, who was with him, he answered. And he said, if they merit, meaning if the people, the Jewish people will merit, I will hasten the coming of Mashiach. If they do not merit, then Messiah will come in its designated time. So that kind of introduces this idea that I was talking about before, where there is in Hebrew called be'ita. Be'ita means in its time. If we don't manage to do the job, then we just get to the end. Or there is achishena, I will hasten it. If we do manage to finish our job that was given to us by Hashem, and we get there, so then Mashiach comes sooner. In Hebrew, we say zachu. If we merit, then it will be achishena. It will be, I will hasten it. But lo zachu, if the Jewish people do not merit, then be'ita, it will be in its time. So this really kind of now understands that there's two completely different models, two different completely ways of the arrival of Mashiach to come. Let's see one more slide to give us a little bit more understanding, and then we'll unpackage. This comes from the famous commentary on the Torah called the Or HaChaim, known as Reb Chaim Ibn Attar, and he gives us interpretation on Numbers 24:16. He says, if the redemption will arrive through the merits of the Jewish people, it will be wondrous. The Redeemer will appear miraculously from the heavens. By contrast, if the Jews are unworthy and the redemption comes only because the clock ran out, it will be different. And he continues, regarding which the Talmud states, the Redeemer will arrive as a pauper riding on a donkey. The prophecy that the redemption will be hastened will occur if the Jewish people will be worthy. Regarding a redemption in the set time, the verse states that a ruler will arise in Israel naturally, as do all rulers in this world. So he's touching on this idea that you see different prophecies talking about the King Mashiach. One place says that he's going to arrive as a pauper riding on a donkey. One place says he's going to come down from heaven. Says he will a ruler will arise in Israel. So which one is it? Will a ruler arise? Will a king, a charismatic leader, get up and start leading the people as all leaders do in a natural sense? So he says, yes, that's if we run out the clock. If we don't merit to bring Mashiach earlier. On the other hand, if we all finish our job and we do everything that we're supposed to, when that moment happens, then there's a miraculous transformation, and a redeemer comes down from heaven and redeems the Jewish people. So we had asked earlier about this contradiction. Will it be miraculous and sudden, or will it be natural and gradual? The answer is depends. Who does it depend on? It depends on us. If we manage to do everything that we need to do before the set time that God has set for Mashiach to come, then we get it early, and we get it in a sudden, miraculous way. If, on the other hand, we don't finish and Mashiach comes because God had to bring him because of the set time that he instilled in the world, so then it's more on a natural process. A ruler will arise, and it's more of a gradual process. Any questions or comments about that? You'll have to unmute yourself. All right.
Okay, the question is, what are we supposed to do then to hasten the come of Mashiach? And since when we know about that, and what are we doing right now?
Yes, that is a great question, and I will not leave you hanging. By the time we finish today, we will definitely talk about what it is that we have to do and what kind of work we're talking about that needs to bring Mashiach. All right, so before we talk specifically about that, we're going to talk about this idea of Mashiach coming. What's the advantage of Mashiach coming in a way of achishen, of being hastened? That if we are meritorious, we merit the coming of Mashiach, so then Mashiach will come sooner. How does that change the quality of Mashiach? So here we are, section 3, the qualities of achishena. Achishena means I will hasten it. All right, before we read that. So earlier on, we had learned in the Rambam, we had learned in Maimonides, all these different things that a Mashiach has to do in order to prove himself as the legitimate Mashiach. And I mentioned that earlier, that the Rambam was kind of giving you details and ways to know if somebody is the right Mashiach or is not, is a true Mashiach or is not a true Mashiach. So the Rambam says that he has to be, he has to fight the wars of Hashem. He has to he has to start gathering all the people that have been exiled and all different things that a Mashiach has to do in order to truly be a Mashiach. However, when we talk about Mashiach coming in a sudden way, then all of these things can happen, but they just happen instantaneously. So we're in a world, and you look around and you say, oh my gosh, the world doesn't look like a messianic world at all. Everyone's fighting, diseases, there's terrible things, right? But that doesn't mean that Mashiach cannot come right now. Because if Mashiach comes right now in a way of achishena, in a way of us meriting and God hastening Mashiach's arrival, within a moment's time, all of that can change. The reality of the world can change within a second, and all of the miracles start to take place. If it's happening in a gradual process, then you have to be able to look around and start seeing the messianic world. But just because you might look around and say, I don't see the world evolving into a messianic era, which we'll talk about soon, if the world is or the world is not. But even if you say the world is not, that doesn't mean that Mashiach cannot come right here, right now, because if Mashiach comes in a way of achishena, in a way of arriving early and arriving in a miraculous way, it could happen anytime. For example, I'll give you an example. It's written in many places that Elijah the prophet, Eliyahu Hanavi, has to come and announce Mashiach's arrival prior to Mashiach's coming, which we will talk a lot about this in class 3 and class 4. But one of the examples of if Mashiach comes in the miraculous sudden way because we merited it is that many of the commentaries understand that if that happens, Elijah the prophet does not have to come and pre-announce the coming of Mashiach. So let's see, I'll show you what I'm talking about over here. Here you have a writing from a famous man called Reb Chaim Yeshaya Halbersberg. And he wrote as follows: when the Talmud and the Midrash speak of the many changes that will occur prior to Mashiach's arrival, the context is that such events must occur only prior to a redemption that comes in the designated time. Thus, Moses and all subsequent sages anticipated a redemption of Achishena, right, a miraculous sudden, so that everything can be in the best possible way. So, like the example that I gave you of Elijah the prophet's arrival prior to Mashiach, announcing Mashiach's coming, the commentaries say that if Mashiach is coming in a way of Achishena, in a way of early coming, miraculous coming, we do not need all of those preconditions before Mashiach's coming. Here we have, okay, before we get to that, so DJ, you kind of asked before, what is it that we have to do for Mashiach to come? What is this work that we're talking about when we talk about, finishing, coming to that arrival of Mashiach? What kind of job are we going to do? I'm just going to close the screen for a second because I want to, just for 2-3 minutes, talk about this. So when we talk about Mashiach's arrival, even if it's sudden, from a spiritual perspective, it's not sudden. It's the culmination of many years of hard work by so many people causing a spiritual transformation. So if we merit the early coming of Mashiach, on a physical reality, it's going to be miraculous and sudden. But from a spiritual reality, that's not sudden at all. It's a culmination of a very long process. What's the process? So the process is what's called redeeming the sparks. So perhaps you've heard of some of those words, and it's something that is spoken about a lot in the Kabbalah of the Arizal. And the Arizal basically explained in many places in Kabbalah, that Hashem buried divine sparks, kind of like souls, in the material world all around us. And he gave us the job of freeing and redeeming, collecting all those spiritual sparks which are trapped inside the different material and physical things in this world. And when we collect all of those sparks, and collectively we've redeemed all of them, that is what brings about the coming of Mashiach. So when we live our lives and we study Torah and we do mitzvot, we do the commandments of Hashem, which are specifically given to us to do with physical things, we are able to see beyond the very basic world around us and see what's behind it. And we study the Torah in regards to physical things. So we might be studying the laws of kosher, we might be studying the laws of business, or we're doing a mitzvah, we're putting on tefillin with animal hides, we're eating kosher food, we're doing all these mitzvot. By doing this, we are freeing the sparks of holiness that God hid inside of these things, and we're slowly collecting them. And accumulatively, once we've collected all of them, then poof, the world is ready for Mashiach, and there we are at its goal. So even if around you, you don't see necessarily what's going on, but there's all of this work of previous generations and of us freeing these spiritual sparks, these holy sparks. And when we've redeemed all of them, then Mashiach comes. Let's reword the same thing, just from a different angle. Hashem, God, created this world, and the point, our job in this world, is to create a home for Hashem in this world. How do we create, or the arrival of Mashiach is the complete realization of this world being a home for Hashem, right? Mashiach comes, means you're going to look around, and this world will be the perfect, ideal home for Hashem. So if you've ever been through the process of building a home, perhaps you can relate to this. I have never been through it. I've done minor renovations, but please God, one day we'll have the opportunity to build a shul. So, right, you make plans and you put in all the hard work, and then the thing is complete and it's move-in day. So Mashiach's arrival is move-in day for Hashem. We've put in all this work to prepare the world for Hashem, for God, that he should be comfortable here. And then Mashiach is move-in day. So how do we make the world a place where Hashem is comfortable? It's basically the same thing that what we're saying before, where we are collecting the sparks from the physical. Meaning, when we look at the physical world around us, we're able to see through it. We're able to see what's the point of everything. We're able to see the Torah and the mitzvot in the world and behind the world. But God also made it a little bit challenging, because he created the forces of evil. And the forces of evil, their goal is to cover over these sparks. So what do? They create temptation. They challenge us not to be able to see past the surface, to be able to only look at the surface. They present the world to us and they say, don't look beyond this beautiful food over here. Just see it at face value and feed your stomach whatever is delicious. Versus the Torah says, no, make sure that you're seeing beyond the surface, and even if it's delicious, make sure that it's kosher. The forces of evil say, oh, here's an opportunity to make money. You don't have to look through it to see if it's 100% ethically clean and perfectly honest. It's an opportunity. That's the forces of evil. God and the Torah wants us to be able to look further and say, no, remember, what's the business about? It's about collecting the sparks that's inside. You only access the spiritual sparks if done according to the Torah, etc. So there's two ways that we can beat the forces of evil and redeem the sparks. One way is that we all pull our weight and we all redeem the sparks around us. And the other way is that God put a time limit on the forces of evil. And at some point, their power, their existence expires. And then automatically, whatever sparks of holiness is still buried in the deep depths of the evil, they get redeemed. So here we come to a very deep and important point. There's two ways for Mashiach to come. One is that we, the people, dig to the deepest, darkest places of the earth, and we redeem the sparks of holiness. So that means is that we challenge apathy, and we overcome all the struggles that we've struggled throughout history, right? We've managed to hold on to our faith through times of deprivation and through times of harshness, and nowadays we're able to hold on to our faith through times of plenty. These are all digging deeper and deeper into the world that God has created to redeem the sparks. When we do that, we are redeeming the sparks from the deepest. We redeem the sparks that are hidden and buried in the deepest places. On the other hand, if the clock runs out and God gets rid of the forces of evil, we didn't manage to redeem the deepest sparks of holiness. All that happened is that God said, okay, I gave you a chance to do it. You did 95% of the work, And ultimately, the 5% or the 1%, the 0.5% that we didn't get to is just lost forever. So another advantage of the model of Mashiach arriving in a sudden, miraculous way because of the work that we did is not only because A, it's sudden, B, it's miraculous, so it could happen at any time. But the real advantage of Mashiach coming as a result of our work is that means that we redeemed, we refined the deepest, darkest, most deep buried sparks, we refined them. As opposed to the other model of Mashiach coming just when Hashem decided Mashiach comes, that means that we didn't reach everything. Just ultimately, God says we're not going to be here forever, and there's certain sparks that are lost, and they're lost, and so be it. So let me go back to my. Here you have a teaching from the Rebbe that kind of talks about what I just said. So the Rebbe says as follows: there is indeed a paradigm about which the verse states God set a date for evil. So there's an end date. Creation itself dictates that evil only has a certain time span, after which it will expire and disappear without a trace. As the verse states, and I will remove the spirit of veil from the world. However, this paradigm is only reserved for a situation in which the Jewish people haven't managed to make such a reality happen with their own transformative work. Then, indeed, the end of days happens on its own. However, if the Jews are so worthy and transform the world, the redemption will arrive prior to its allotted time. For though the clock will not yet have run out on evil, the Jews will have managed to banish it with their transformative work. This then is the true quality of Achishena. Achishena means sudden, over Be'ita in its time. It transforms even the darkest of evils. So I want to highlight that last sentence, that when we, the people, bring Mashiach in a hurried state because we merit that through our work, that means that we transformed even the darkest of evils. And I want that just to sink in for 60 seconds. And if you have any questions, please speak up. Does anybody have any questions?
Rabbi, this is Leslie. Are the Jewish people the only ones on earth who are redeeming sparks?
Great question. The answer is no. Everyone is redeeming sparks. They just do it differently. But everyone.
What is the significance?
Everyone is redeeming sparks through their fulfillment of the parts of the Torah that apply to them. Does that make sense? In fact, the Rebbe spoke very strongly that in order for Mashiach to come, we need all the nations of the world to start fulfilling the 7 Noahide laws, which each one is really a category on its own. So you're absolutely right. It involves all of mankind, and the Jewish people have a responsibility to teach this to the world. And and those non-Jews have a responsibility to keep their part, and everyone has to assist everyone. So the Jewish people have to assist the non-Jewish people with their parts, and the non-Jewish people have to assist the Jewish people with their parts. But it's definitely because Mashiach is for the entire world. So I hope that answered the question. So in summary, there's 2 great qualities of if Mashiach comes in a sudden way because of our work. Number 1, we don't need to wait for all these things to start happening. We don't have to start waiting for a king to arise and prove himself and for all different things to happen. It could just happen suddenly. So you can look around and say, hey, I don't see Mashiach coming. But that doesn't mean that Mashiach's not coming. And on a much deeper level, if Mashiach comes because we accomplished it through our work, it's qualitatively a much greater Mashiach, because Mashiach, what is the work? Like DJ asked earlier, what is the work that we have to do? The answer is we have to redeem the sparks. We have to be able to see past the very basic level of what physicality is about. And we get rid of the evil by seeing past it, by ignoring it and redeeming the sparks. So when we work for that, that means that we redeemed all the way to the deepest buried sparks, as opposed to if Hashem brings Mashiach because we run the clock out, then we might have left some sparks behind. It just is what it is, because at some point, evil will run its course. All right.
What was the significance of the term end of days happens?
Say the question.
The end of time. It said then the end of days happens. What does that mean? Is end of time as we know it?
The end of days is the way we know it. So days the way we have it now. We'll discuss this kind of a bit later. What does the world look like once Mashiach has come? You know, is there still time? Is there people? Is there food? Do we have to eat? We'll get to discussing that. But when we talk about just the end of days, I mean, it's a borrowed term from the prophets, but it means, you know, the end of days the way we know days. It's the end of exile days and on to a different kind of day. But we'll talk a little bit more about, you know, what does the day look like? What do you do at 6 a.m. in the morning when you wake up every day when Mashiach comes? What are you going to be busy with? Will you go to work, etc., etc.? But as of now, we've understand these two models of how Mashiach can come. Either that's called Poof, right? Could happen suddenly through our work in a miraculous way, or it could happen through a gradual process because the clock ran out and Mashiach come. So lastly, we want to just talk about this last section that can happen any day. And what we want to talk about is as follows. So we already said that if we merit, Mashiach can come, you know, any second. But I want to talk a little bit more about that. We know from numerous sources, and I'm sure you've heard me talk about this many times, that it's an integral belief in Judaism to believe A, in the coming of Mashiach, and B, in part and parcel of that belief is that Mashiach can come today. And the Rambam Maimonides is very clear about this in his 13 principles of faith. It's not enough to believe that a Mashiach will one day arrive. We believe that Mashiach can come any day, including today. So if we are to understand that Mashiach is coming as a result of a gradual process, then how is Mashiach going to come today? And I'll reframe the question. Is it possible that today is the last day on Hashem's clock? Now, it's obviously possible that Mashiach can come today as a miraculous sudden occurrence because we finished our work. That could happen any day, anytime, no matter what the world looks like around you. But is it possible that today, November 1st, 2020, the 14th of Cheshvan, 5781, is the last day on Hashem's clock where God said, this is the day that Mashiach is going to come? And if the answer is yes, which it is, then how do you say that the world is gradually making its way towards Mashiach? So, believe it or not, as much as the world looks crazy around us, the Rebbe would often point to different events that are taking place around the world, and the Rebbe did this very often, and point out that these events that are taking place in the world are events that are taking place which are gradually leading the world to a place of Moshiach. So, yes, I understand that the world is full of hardship and craziness, and I'm not, God forbid, taking away from the people that are suffering. But if you allow yourself, you will actually see that there are many things taking place in the world that are bringing the world to a time of Moshiach. So even if the world is coming in the Be'ita, which means in its time, because God is going to run out the clock and say, this is the end, but there is so many things happening around us that is bringing the world to a gradual place of Mashiach. And here you have from the Rebbe himself. The Rebbe said, we now have an answer to all the chatter about our recent hype about Mashiach's imminent arrival. So the Rebbe had been talking about Mashiach, and people had been talking, saying, how could the Rebbe be saying that? And they said, after all, how will such a hype be received at home? What will Main Street think about such talk, right? The Rebbe's obviously being sarcastic, but like you go to somebody and say, oh, Mashiach is going to come today, they'll tell you that you're crazy. The answer is, if the elements of redemption were completely foreign, it would indeed be a tough sell. However, because they are not foreign at all, and in fact, much of it is already underway in our very material present-day reality, an imminent day redemption will not be surprising. And what I'm going to do now is just give you 3 or 4 examples that the Rebbe pointed out, how the world is leading itself gradually in a natural way to be more ready for Moshiach. The first one is regarding democracy, global peace, and religious liberty. So, you know, if you pay attention for a minute, which I'm sure all of you do, the world in terms of democracy is better than it ever was, or at least better than the last few hundred years. Even if you take something as simple as Russia, which up until 30 years ago was harassing so many Jews, Russia nowadays is flourishing with Judaism. There are countless synagogues, museums, day schools, yeshivot. That it is blossoming, and take a place like America. The religious liberty that we are provided in America is unprecedented in history, to be in a foreign country which was not our own, which wasn't Israel, that allowed us to celebrate our religion in such a way. Believe it or not, as crazy as it sounds, the Rebbe pointed out that the institution called the UN, the Rebbe said, is actually in a way, it's preparing the world for Mashiach. So we know that the UN, as faulted as they may be, and as anti-Israel and anti-Semitic as they may be, but the idea of having such a body is a preparation for a perfect world. Because what is it saying? It's saying all nations are coming together, and ideally supposed to be that the goal of this institution is to help other nations. When else did you ever have that in history? In other words, the framework is in place, so to say, for a gradual messianic era. It's just some people are a little bit confused and a little bit blinded. But when you have all these nations that are saying, we are dedicated, we're giving so much money to help other people, if that's not messianic, what is? Of course, we know the famous prophecy that says they will beat their swords into plowshares. And that is actually up on the wall right outside the UN. That's the prophecy that they wrote from the Torah. So the idea is to stop war and put money and all that energy into helping human aid. If that's not Mashiach, what is? Let's take a look at the Rebbe, what the Rebbe says about this. And you can see that on the screen or in your student book on page 14. In these times, heads of state the world over have decided to reduce their weapons capacity and invest in economic peaceful measures. This is, after all, what the prophet promises, that they will beat their swords into plowshares, dismantling weapons and fashioning them into tools to work the ground to produce bread. We have a clear sign that the signs of the ultimate redemption are beginning to blossom. Many great and mighty countries are reformed and established noble governments grounded in just and fair laws. This too is a foretaste of the overall reform and peace that Mashiach will bring to the world. Another realization of this promise is the world's attitude to the Jewish people as we've been granted religious freedom. So there you have one idea, that, not taking away from the craziness that exists in some places, but it's historic what is taking places. Another idea, which was mentioned earlier, is the ingathering of the exiles. One of the prophecies of Moshiach is all of the people returning back to Israel. And as mentioned earlier, you have so many Jews returning to Israel, especially with the fall of communism in Russia. You had thousands and thousands and thousands of Jews going back to Israel. You had Jews from Ethiopia going back to Israel, and other examples as well. There was one other one that I wanted to point out. Two other ones that I wanted to point out is the access to knowledge, and more specifically, the access to the inner teachings of the Torah. So many people, when you start talking to them about Kabbalah or Chassidut, the inner teachings of the Torah, they'll tell you, I thought we're not allowed to learn Kabbalah, right? We're not allowed to learn the inner mystical teachings of the Torah because you have to be 40 and you have to have all these different things, which was true. There was a time in history where you were not allowed to learn it. However, over the many generations, starting with the Arizal and the Baal Shem Tov and the different Hasidic masters, this has become accessible and available to every single person, which is preparing the world for Mashiach. Because when Mashiach comes, what are we all going to be busy with? When Mashiach comes, we're all going to be busy with knowing Hashem. That's what the Rambam says. Maimonides writes, when Mashiach comes, Reuven, you asked before, what are we going to be doing when Mashiach comes? The answer is we're going to be busy acquiring the knowledge of Hashem. So in the last 200-300 years, that has been so much more prevalent and available to every single person. And that is a tremendous sign of Mashiach's coming. In a similar vein, by the way, the concept of being joyous is, and Jews being joyous, is also making our way towards Mashiach. What do I mean? When the temple was destroyed and Jews were sent into exile, the rabbis of the time enacted many rules decreasing how joyous we are allowed to be. And what that did was it kind of created a feeling within Judaism of being very somber and very serious because the temple was destroyed, right? Even under a chuppah, wedding canopy, we smash a glass. That's to diminish the level of happiness because we recognize that we don't have the temple. We're not in Jerusalem. We don't have Mashiach. People, when they build a house, often will leave a part of the house unfinished to remember the destruction and the exile. So there was these rules set in place to put boundaries on joy, and that introduced a certain somberness and seriousness into Jewish culture. However, beginning with the Baal Shem Tov 300 years ago, he started to change that. He started to reintroduce the idea of being joyous, and this has become increasingly accepted amongst all Jews, where there's much more singing and dancing, everything. And that ultimately is in preparation for Mashiach. So whether you look at the availability and the access to Torah information, and more specifically, the inner teachings of the Torah, through the Arizal and the Baal Shem Tov, the idea of being joyous, the democracy and liberty and freedom that religious people have, the ingathering of exiles, the ability for everyone to go to Israel, all of these things, what they point to, and so many other things, whether it be technology, we can go on and on and on, but so many different signs that we have, they are preparing the world gradually for Mashiach. So when we talk about Mashiach coming, even if it's in the form of Be'ita in its time, that has to be gradual, there's no doubt that the world is preparing itself for the arrival of Mashiach. So in conclusion, we explained, I'm just going to wrap up now for 60 seconds. We explained that there are different descriptions of how Mashiach can come. One is that Mashiach will come in a miraculous, sudden way. The other one is that Mashiach will come in a gradual, natural way. And we explained that this is two ways of Mashiach can come. Mashiach can come because we merit Mashiach's arrival through our work being the idea of redeeming the sparks, of preparing a home for Hashem, which that mode of Mashiach coming is sudden, miraculous. So even if you look around and you see Mashiach, you don't see Mashiach anywhere, it could happen automatically. We explained that qualitatively, that is a deeper Mashiach because we have redeemed the deepest, darkest sparks that have been hidden and buried in the deepest levels of evil. And that's one mode of Mashiach coming. The other model of Mashiach coming is because we run out the clock and God has a set time for Mashiach to come. And over there, the Rebbe said that the creation of evil has to end. The nature of evil is that it has to end. So eventually Mashiach will come, even if we don't finish our work. And in that sense, Mashiach will come through a gradual, natural way. And then we ended off by saying that really, if you look around, we do see the world gradually evolving itself and preparing itself even for a natural Mashiach, whether it be access to Torah information and the secrets of the Torah, the joy introduced by the Baal Shem Tov, democracy introduced into the world, religious liberty, Jewish people being able to return to Israel. All of these different things show that the world is preparing itself for Mashiach. So may it be speedily in our days. Today, may we merit the coming of Mashiach. And if God forbid Mashiach doesn't come by next week's class will be called Gog and Magog. So stay tuned for that one. I'm going to end the recording. So if you have any questions that you didn't want to be on the recording, you can speak up now.